became a lawyer and started doing tax, the whole thing about budget exercise was a very exciting thing. I remember, actually Krishnan and I go a long way back. We all worked together in the same firm many years back. And in those days, budget used to be presented at 4 o'clock in the evening in the Westminster model. And by the time it would be 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the night, we would have become experts and we would have read the whole thing and come out with our own presentations and so on and so forth. There was a lot of mystery shrouding around the whole budget making process. It was shrouded in secrecy and people wouldn't really know what to expect. In the last 18 years, what has been noticed every day, every time, is that the government has made effective measures to take this mystery out of this whole equation of budget making process. So much so that you can almost predict that this is the likely scenario that will pan out. A couple of days or weeks before this budget was rolling out, people thought the super rich tax will come, and everybody knew about it. People expected it because there's a lot of discussion going on. So the point I'm trying to make is that this budget was a damn squib because there was nothing much to offer. Not because the government didn't want to do it, it's just that budget is not the only day when the government would want to make changes. And that is what Pranab Mukherjee said the last time when he was the finance minister, that this is just one such step and not the only step. So I wasn't very surprised. I went back home very early that day and I slept. I had a nice sleep, which I typically don't have on a budget night. So that was the prelude to this entire budget making process. That mystery is all gone. Now let's also understand the politics of that. Economy and politics and finance, they all go hand in hand. You cannot look at it in isolation. This was an election year, this was an election budget. Therefore, the focus of the government was more to appease the people and the vote bank that they're talking about. And therefore, they wanted to bring a strong message, whether it is to the women of the country, whether it is to the agriculturists, whether it is to the trade unions and whatever else. And therefore, raising finance was probably not the biggest issue that the government was facing. And if you notice, Chidambaram made a very smart comment. Throughout the budget, if you were listening to me carefully, all his budget estimates, all his projections of expenditure and income for the coming year was based on a benchmark of last year's revised budget estimates and not the original budget estimates. The difference between revised estimates and the original estimate is if in the previous year the original estimation was 5,000 crores as to spend on roads and you ended up spending only 2,000 crores. That 2,000 crores is your revised estimates. So therefore the numbers were not stacking up with the previous year's starting point, but it was trying to stack up with the previous year's end point. And therefore he had a lot of headroom to to play with in that environment. So that was one aspect of that. The second aspect of that is the GDP has come down significantly from the 8% era to below 6% era. Typically, and this is something that we have noticed, and I come from indirect tax. Typically, indirect tax is used as a tool to increase consumption. When you increase consumption, effectively what you're doing is you're trying to create a demand-supply connection. In other words, put it simply in a layman's language, if television suddenly becomes cheaper than the rate that was prevailing earlier on, there would be a beeline before all the television shops for you to buy them. And that happens by market force, or it could happen by reduction of tax costs. The government has many times used reduction of tax costs as a tool to effectively increase consumption, and increased consumption means more production, and more production means more consumption on the cost side and the input side and so on and so forth, and therefore there is a ripple effect in the economy whereby everybody kind of gains. We would have expected that in a sub 6.4% GDP situation, the government would have tried to do some of those things by trying to reduce the tax rates. To our surprise and shock, we don't see any movement in the tax rates, or there is no carte blanche reduction in the tax rates as we had seen 3-4 years back. And there are many theories doing the round. Was it a good idea to have reduced excise duty rate from then 16% to 8%? Or should it not have been calibrated and so on and so forth? I'm not going into that debate, but the short point is, you have a situation where the government could have reduced the tax rates to increase consumption and fuel the economy by creating more demand, but that hasn't happened. So that's the second critique that I'd like to point. The third is, when you have an election year budget, you do not generally make significant changes with respect to the tax policies, etc., such that the benefit, if you do not come to power, the benefit is going to be taken by the incumbent government. So that's something that always lurks in the mind. But having said that, realistically speaking, there was not much to do. Last year, the whole service tax regime was completely changed, and we have a new concept of levy of service tax, which is called the negative list, which means everything on earth is taxable barring 10 or 15 of services. Versus the situation that used to prevail earlier on, where you had 120 or 120 services that were defined and they were liable to tax. The rest of the world was not liable to tax. So therefore, there was a significant shift. That shift or that change in the policy took place previous year, and there wasn't much to play with now. And therefore, it appears that the budget was a time squib because all the changes had already happened in 2011, 12, 12, 13, so to say. The other point that has to be taken note of, GST is probably the most important tool, most remarkable change in tax policy that this government for the last 9 years has been advocating, and rightly so. To our utter shock and surprise, I must tell you that the GST mention came at the faggot of his budget speech, which was no more than a couple of minutes. That's about it. Which was the shocking part. I would have believed that he should have started by saying that, we continue to believe that GST is our mainstay tax policy for the future. These are the 10-15 things that we have done, and because of these impediments, we are not able to usher it in now, rather than slip it in as a last great thought at the end of his budget. So effectively what has happened is, the hullabaloo around GST for the last 9 years has suddenly gone completely lackluster, and we'll have to wait for the new government to be able to talk about it. And there are 3-4 very important things that are required for this whole GST thing to come through. First and foremost is the constitutional amendment bill, and that is where I want to spend a couple of minutes for you, all guys. The constitutional amendment bill is probably the basic structure without which this GST will never come through. We are a federal country, we are a country where states and the central government work in harmony. But the separation and segregation of power, which is so fundamental to our constitution, does not allow the state government to levy tax on central tax matters, and thus the state government is debarred from levying tax on the state government. So the list 1, list 2, list 3, that equation is very, very fundamental, and unless you change that, unless the taxing power under 286, 246, etc. are changed, such that the state and central are equally permitted to levy tax on manufacture, sale, and so on and so forth, you are not going to see a GST ever in your life. That's the reality. And for that to happen, the constitutional amendment bill has to go through, and for that to happen, 2/3 of the parliament has to be sitting and voting for it. We have a situation where there is no consensus because the mandate is fractured, and until the fractured mandate becomes hegemony of any one large party, you probably will not see a constitutional amendment bill coming through for a long, long time. But that said, there was another very important roadblock. The other roadblock was that the state governments were hampering for compensation in the form of CST loss, central sales tax loss, that they will have to forego if they were to move into GST. That quantum, aggregate quantum, was agreed to around 90 billion rupees. The good news is that the central government, the finance ministry, has agreed to compensate the states to the extent of the 90 billion rupees. Yesterday, the news is that there is a network required for GST implementation, which is called the GST network, which is a software and hardware kind of thing, where the CEO has been appointed and the team has been formally engaged to roll it out. Some movement in the goods, rate of customs duties and excise duty, various products have become cheaper and so on and so forth. But my favorite line is that the favorite whipping boy of the country, which is cigarettes, has become expensive. Thank you.
GST and DTC become a game changer